what's the benefit of this knowledge? So somebody out there might be like, okay, that's cool, interesting, but what does that mean to us today?
So that's a question that I'm frequently asked when I'm a guest on Carl Nelson's show. Why is history important? Well, look, history is everything. History is life. You meet a woman for the first time. First thing you want to know is her name, her telephone number. Where do you live? That's his history. You go to a doctor for the first time. They're going to want to know your medical history. What diseases do you have? What diseases ran in your family? You go for a job interview. Folk want to know your job history. So everything that is a part of our lives revolves around history. So if you steal a people, if you make it illegal for them to document their history, if you erase their cultural memory, then they will be whatever you say they are. And someone without a historical memory, without a historical background, will ask you, why is history important? No one asks a Christian why the history of Jesus is important. No one asks a Jew why the history of Abraham and Moses is important. No one asks a Muslim why the history of Muhammad is important. So why is it when African people want to talk about our story, people now suddenly question the need to bring up history? History is all that matters, brother. And as my friend James Small says, history will erase the mystery. When you know who you are, when you're clear about the cultural tendencies that you have inherited, when you know what you've done, you know what you can do. And when you do what you've done, you'll find out that you can do it better than anybody else. That is what our history has substantiated time and time again.
Wow, quite powerful, quite powerful. I too am a child of the civil rights movement, and I grew up in the '60s. I remember, look, when they killed Dr. King, I'm the neighborhood paper boy. Okay, so it's interesting because a couple of years ago, I made my first trip to Ghana after I've been going to South Africa since 2010. Every single year. Went to Ghana with Dr. Arikana Chiambori Kwao, and part of that program, we had a candlelight vigil at the Cape Coast Dungeon. Now, for me, the sheer size of that dungeon or castle, we call it dungeon, really hit me in the gut, right, of how massive the transatlantic slave trade was. And then in the words that we heard during the course of the candlelight vigil, really, really, opened my mind a little bit more. I was reminded, because the rabbi that gave the tour, he says,
Rabbi.
Rabbi Cohen.
Rabbi Cohen. Yes, indeed.
Yes.
Met him many times.
He says, they would have us think that we were naked savages, but understand we were architects, we were artisans, we were kings, we were queens, And I remember back in the '60s, we had Ebony magazine, and my mom she always used to get books out of for us out of Ebony, and so the one book that opened my mind was Before the Mayflower. And I think I still might have that around here somewhere, and then you were speaking about psychology. My dad got me Black Rage, Price and Cobb, two psychology.
I remember that book.
And, but just having that exposure to the information that there were great empires, great civilizations, and it does make you stand stronger, make you think a little bit more straighter, I guess is the word I'd like to use at this time. And then as a grown man, having gone out through the Cape Coast dungeon, when I finished the candlelight vigil, the first thing that I said was, what is the big deal about critical race theory? It happened. It's like you have this ginormous edifice right here, and there's like 60 or 70 of them that dot the western coast of Africa. It happened. Why are we not allowed to tell our story? Why are states and governments so intent on silencing that piece of history? Is it fear?
Well, brother, look, it's as Asa Hilliard, another dear friend, colleague, and Jegna and ancestor said, mental slavery is worse than physical slavery because the mental slave believes that he or she are free never realizing that the shackles are on their mind. And as Dr. Carter G. Woodson, who we're honoring this month, said that if you control a person's thinking, you don't have to worry about their actions. You don't have to order them to go to the back door because they will go without being told. And if there is no back door, they will create one. So miseducation, mental manipulation has always been the rule of the day for evil people who seek to make their fortunes enslaving, conquering, and taking advantage of others. This is as old as time itself. But what we have to realize is that the situation of African people living in the diaspora, the story of the enslavement of African people is probably one of the most distorted stories of any people on the planet. There are 138 slave dungeons built along the coast of West Africa between Senegal and Cameroon. 138 slave dungeons. And during the course of the European enslavement of African people, which lasted from 1444 until 1888, we're talking about the loss of life, which is the equivalent of over 100 million people. Now, Dr. Clark often talked about this number, but even if we give a conservative number, even if we gave a conservative number of 50 million people, men, women, and children, and you saw Cape Coast Dungeon and Elmina Dungeon in Ghana. So you saw that there were slave pens for the men, there were slave pens for the women, there were slave pens for the children. Nobody was spared. Entire villages were decimated between 1444 and 1888. So countless lives were destroyed. And these Europeans, every European nation with the exception of Russia, participated in the wholesale theft, sale, and enslavement of African people. So the presence of Africans in the Americas, for example, is the primary result of Europeans stealing, raping, selling, and abusing over 13 generations of African people here in the United States alone. So these are historical facts. And one of the issues that we're dealing with has been mirrored in South Africa, where you said you spend a lot of time traveling. When Europeans in South Africa established apartheid, its purpose was to erase the historical and cultural memory of continental Africans. And that when apartheid came to an end, the creators of that vicious, inhumane system were afraid that if Africans came into power, Africans would do to the Europeans what the Europeans had done to us. If you look at history, you will find that nowhere in the history of African people have there been instances where Africans have sought to discover Europeans, conquer them, and enslave them. That is not our way. That is not our nature. But if we're clear about the study of history, we'll find that not only did every European nation, with the exception of Russia, participated in the wholesale theft, sale, and enslavement of African people, which was sanctioned by the Pope, sanctioned by the Vatican. Pope Eugenius IV wrote the papal bull stating that Africans had no soul, so that it was perfectly all right for Christians to steal Africans, sell them, rape them, because Africans had no soul. So these are issues that we have to look at. We need to understand why English is the language of commerce. English is the language of science. English is the language of history and culture and civility. Why is that? Why is it that this tiny little island off the coast of Europe controlled at one point 85% of the planet and the planet's resources? When we begin to ask these questions and begin to understand who people of European ancestry are, we will have a better idea of the death and destruction they have spread around the world and how to defend ourselves against these acts, which are still happening right now. And to your point, one of the reasons why people in the United States are so intent on suppressing critical race theory, diversity, equity, and inclusion, the teaching of enslavement in America, the teaching of African history, is because they are fearful that if we discover who we really are, if they discover what our ancestors have done, then we will realize that we carry our ancestors' memories in us. We carry our ancestors' capacity for power and greatness within us. And that once we start turning to ourselves, as opposed to being dependent on our former oppressors to hire us, to educate us, to do for us, once we become self-sufficient, then the game is over. So when you understand these dynamics, then it makes perfectly good sense why Donald Trump behaves the way he does, why the Republican Party has lost their mind, why politicians are doing everything within their